Alright, Gabriot here with another guide-oriented video coming your way. 35 not-so-obvious interactions every Monster Train player should know. And I've tried to order them such that the first ones are maybe the most important ones that you actually really should know. But in true YouTube, modern YouTube fashion, gotta try to make a flashy title or nobody will watch it, so we'll just say they're all essential. And on a similar note, got a little something different today in the video description section. Along with my usual chapter markers that I like to provide with every video, you're also going to notice a set of links to Twitch and YouTube channels. These are Monster Train related streamers and content creators that I highly respect. Some of them have been around a while, some of them are brand new. Go ahead and check them out. I can say from personal experience, trying to be, trying to get a channel off the ground running is so freaking hard. I mean, honestly, like I can search basically anybody in this list, myself included. It's like you can search their exact username, like pretty much the exact title of a video exists, and it just won't even show up. The algorithm is so against you. The YouTube algorithm is so against you when you're kind of a brand new or otherwise unknown streamer. So any support you can give those guys, I'm sure they'd appreciate. Please check them out when you have time. I can definitely vouch for all their content being top notch. Now anyway, so you'll notice a little bit of high quality clip art here in the title here. These are banners. If you did not know what a banner unit is, well, this is the guide for you. Let's get right into that first item here. Number 1 of 35 banner units. So if you see that icon on the map, right here I have the Awoken and Stygian pictured, but it's going to be a different, color art for each clan, but they'll look kind of like that, a banner with some swords around it, flapping in the wind. See these on the map? This is going to give you the chance to add a banner unit to your deck. What's a banner unit, you say? A banner unit is any unit offered at these banner icons on the map. Any unit offered at Ring 1 and 2 unit draft trial rewards, so that's, you might take a Mark of Invasion or plus armor, whatever it may be to get a reward. You're either going to get gold or you're going to get a unit draft. If it's a unit draft, it's going to be a banner unit draft. I wish that they named it banner unit draft to make it a little more obvious, but it is a banner unit for the record. Or any unit offered as a unit reward after the Ring 3 flying boss is killed. If you weren't aware of this, Ring 3, that's Daedalus, Talos, currently. Maybe there'll be more in the future, but at the time of this video, those are the 2 bosses you can find at Ring 3. You're always offered a banner unit in the rewards there, right after the rare offering, and we'll get to some of that later too. And a quick note here, there are 2 banner units that are the exception to these rules here. The Bounty Stalker and Dante. Dante is going to be offered at the Ring 3 Cavern, and he comes later on if you choose to take his event. Bounty Stalker just kind of is in his own little world, like Melting Remnant. He can show up outside the banner unit rewards. Even though he's technically a banner unit, he'll show up as a banner unit, which I'll get to in a bit here. And then real quick, any unit offered in the normal card rewards outside of the above conditions is not a banner unit. So if you didn't click on that banner icon or you didn't get it in those specific type of rewards, it's not a banner unit. So think of like Draft, Imps, etc. And you will not receive the draw order benefits that a banner unit receives. And we'll get to that now. So what's so special about banner units versus regular units then? Well, when you draw through your deck initially, you're always guaranteed at least 1 banner unit in your opening hand. And also, if you still have banner units left after that, every turn thereafter you'll get at least 1 banner unit on each turn. So say you have, and I talked about this, just quick examples here, like Wickless Baron is a banner unit. Imp's not going to be a banner unit. So say you have a Wickless Baron, let's say you have 3 of them for the sake of argument. You're always going to draw at least one of them. You could draw more than one of them, but you're always going to draw at least 1 turn 1. And if you only drew 1, you got 2 left, right? So on turn 2, now you're going to at least draw another one, or both. And if you only draw 1 again, so if you've drawn 2 of your 3, turn 3, you're still going to draw that last Wickless Baron. And that's, any banner unit you have is going to be in that pool. And, most experienced players know this one, so this is definitely one that's maybe for the newer players. But I got to tell you, I didn't know this for a long time playing the game, and the minute I learned this, obviously you can use this to your advantage, right? Now that you know you're guaranteed a banner unit, some of the times you might not want to fill your deck with too many banner units, because you might want to just guarantee you get like your high priority banner unit. I often do this in like a Primordium superfood type run, where it's like, well, I just plan on stacking the hell out of a bunch of buffs on one unit, and I want that unit to be a sweeper or something, so I just take a sweeper unit and that's it. I'm like, I'm not going to take any more banner units. Or maybe you take some and later on in the run you've ironed out your strategy, and the less good banner units become top priority removals to purge from your deck. That way you're just going to draw your priority removal later on. That's totally fine too. So this is good knowledge to know, definitely should be able to improve your game if you didn't know it before. And also, I don't think, let me check real quick. Okay, I didn't mention this as well, but it's worth mentioning also, you should also have the knowledge that ring 4, so that's the first ring following that ring 3 flying boss, Daedalus or Talos. Ring 4 is when you're gonna get your final banner unit offered on the map. Past that, it'll never show up in the fight rewards. Unit draft is unique to ring 1 and 2 trials. It's never going to show up after that. After ring 1 and 2 trials, you're either getting gold or artifacts. And that's a free fact I'm giving you. That's one outside the 35. But yeah, it closely ties into this. What you'll want to know about that, though, is past ring 4, don't be holding your breath for any banner units, because you're not going to find them. There's absolutely no way you find them. So make that last choice count. If you think you still need another banner unit, there's always going to be a one side that has a banner unit in ring 4. Hit it up and hope you get something good. Probably take it even if it's not good, and try to make it work if your deck seems kind of weak, right? But yeah, banner units, there's a 1 of 35. Now we're on to 2 of 35, card rarity. And this one, this is a bit ambiguous, but we're going to get into a bit here that, similar to banner units, I did not know for the longest time a lot of the interactions here. So real quick, you're going to see this dot right here. Hopefully my mouse shows up in the video. I believe it will, but I'm pointing at the middle of these cards, and you'll notice this dot. It's white here on Wildwood Sap, it's blue here on Mortal Entrapment, and it's purple here on Spike of the Stygian. There's probably a more specific color that this is than purple, but we'll go with purple. Anyway, that's going to represent a common, uncommon, and rare tier, or tier? Yeah, we'll say tier of card. Rarity, we'll say. But this is a little bit different than a lot of other card games. The gold standard we know is probably Slay the Spire, right? They have similar common, uncommon, and rare tier cards. However, there's some unique goings on here in Monster Train. And I'll be honest, it took me several hundred hours into the game to even realize this, but the common tier is not offered past the first 2 rings. Let me repeat that. Common tier, outside of cavern events, not offered outside the first 2 rings. So, wow. And we're gonna actually, this is so important, I think, personally, that I am going to spend some time to go over every single common in the game real quick, just to show why this is important. But the uncommons and the rares, that's all you're offered past the first 2 ring rewards. So ring 3 and beyond, ring 3 are guaranteed rares. And then beyond that, only uncommons and rares. That's good. That's good knowledge to know, because what if you were holding out for Wildwood Sap? Well, unless you're going to get the cavern event that gives you consumable cards, you're not getting it. You holding out for a molded? Not getting it. And there's no cavern event that will get you that one. But let's go ahead and get into each thing here. Yeah, it's also worth going over this just so it's clear. I figured I'd be clear on everything and not assume everybody just knows every little thing about the game. So At the beginning of every Covenant game, your deck's going to be filled with 2 copies of common cards, and from each clan. So 2 from your primary, 2 from your secondary, and then a single copy of an uncommon from the primary clan. So right here you'll see pictured we have a Melting Remnant primary and Hellhorn secondary type run. So we got offered the Molten Encasement. It's a common. Get 2 of them. Welder Helper's a common. And both of them, by the way, units, but not banner units. It's never going to be a banner unit. Never do you have a banner unit in the opener outside of Mutators. And then, yeah, uncommon from, blue tier. Always will be blue tier from your primary clan. In this case, Crushing Demise. Always happy to see that one, but that is just a side comment. Anyway, figured that was worth pointing out. Let's see. I guess on this slide, I basically say what I already just said. So, yeah, you can go ahead and pause and read that if you didn't really get vocally what I was just saying. But let's get into the choices here. Oh, right. So, it's probably also just worth noting, every clan has 8 common cards that are in their pools. There's no variance there. Awoken, you're gonna have 8 commons. Melting, you have 8 commons. And I don't count the basic cards. Basic would be like Torch, Jesus, I can't even think of another one. Torch. But I'm not counting those because you're never going to get offered those later on. So it's 8 commons that are actually available to be offered. And that's good to know also if you're trying to think how likely it is to get something, right? Because you're likely in the first 2 rings, almost most of the time, the 3 cards that you get offered as your normal rewards are always going to be commons. That's not always the case. You can get uncommons and even rares in those first 2 rings. Although I will say rares are quite rare. No one's ever been able to really nail down the exact likelihood of any of those, but I can tell you it's almost always commons, just from personal experience. And if you know that there's 8 common cards, so let's say you have 1 common card you're on the lookout for. Let's say you're Melting Remnant primary or whatever, and you're not the exiled version, so dregs are your basic card, and you want to know how likely it is to find molded. Well, you know that it's a common, there's 8 commons, so with 3 commons being offered, that means you're going to have roughly a 3/8 chance to find that. And another thing to remember is that in the first 2 rings, it actually keeps your commons, your offerings clan specific. That changes later on, but for those first 2 rings, it's clan specific. So you're going to have a 3 out of 8 chance on your Melting Remnant offerings to find molded. Now that's not exact, by the way, because as I said, there's uncommons, there's rares, but more or less 3 or 8s, and then basically twice, because ring 1 rewards and ring 2 rewards. It's worth knowing, I think. I mean, these are things I take into account when I'm trying to plan out my run. So now, as I mentioned before, took longer than I thought to get there, but here we are. We're going to look at the commons for each clan, just to give yourself some game plans here. So let's think about Hellhorned. Well, these are 2 options of AoE. So you're going to have roughly, 2 out of the 8 offerings, 3 cards. You might be kind of likely to get AoE, but you also got to think, if I need AoE, I should lock it in now, right? Because you're probably not guaranteed this type of AoE later on in a run, at least for Hellhorned. Your only other real AoE that you're looking at for Hellhorned is Inferno. And Inferno isn't AoE that's very friendly to your floor, right? It's also quite expensive. It's a great card in its own right, but it serves a different type of purpose, I would say, than these do. These are just cleaning up the low health units and preserving your floor in the process. So if you need that, a good example would be like if you're facing Seraph the Temperate, where those double Shade Wings, like basically every wave, are no joke at all. You would want to probably snag one of these if you see it. or at the very least know what your odds are of getting it, to try to be on the lookout for it. And also just some other things like Shardtail. Shardtail is a champ I find a lot of newer players struggle with. And I think a big thing is to realize that Welder Helper is like top tier in Shardtail. I plan on doing a Shardtail like guide at some point in the near future. I'm working on it. I'll get more into that, but just a spoiler alert, like Welder Helper is one of the best cards you can find for Shardtail, and having the knowledge that it's only the first 2 rings that you can possibly find Welder Helper makes it so you actually lock that in with pretty high priority. You gotta have a pretty good reason not to take Welder Helper if you're Shardtail. And then other things, it's like overstacking. Hidden Passage is probably the best way to overstack your own floors. True, you can find Tireless Climb later on, but that dazes you twice and costs double the amount of Hidden Passage. So if you're overstacking is something you're looking for, you probably want to lock in a Hidden Passage because you're not going to find it past those first 2 rings. And then also just like Rage and scaling. Some people like Fledgling Imp. I don't number myself among them, but you know, if that's a way you like to scale, you should probably lock it in because you're not going to find that. The only thing you'll find is Shardtail can make it with Imp Parade if you want to go that route. But then also like Ritual Battle. Now I will say these are a bit different than like Welder Helper because there is other Rage options at the uncommon and common tier. However, I think it's still pretty nice to not have to rely on finding those and just to lock in a ritual early, off and on. If scaling is something you need, getting a rituals is pretty good, especially early on if you can find a Merchant of Magic and get it down to a 1 cost. Then you're looking at a pretty good card. But that's Hellhorn. Now we're on to the Awoken. So there's a lot of scaling options here. In my opinion, the best is going to be Razorsharp Edge, but it is definitely worth having this knowledge that first 2 rings, if you don't find Razorsharp Edge, you're not finding it. And to be honest, with Awoken, as nice as their kind of stat boosting cards are here, offensively, you don't really have any options that come up past the common tier. So you could argue Adaptive Mutation kinda, but that's a little situational. You just don't have the flat offensively scaling cards. So you probably, if you need scaling, and especially if you need offensive scaling, you should lock these in if you see them. Particularly Razorsharp Edge, but also if it's like ring 2 and your only option is a Steel Enhancer or Sharpen, you might just want to bite the bullet, even though they're not like top tier damage scaling cards, and just get them so that you actually have some sort of damage scaling. And you can make it work later on with upgrades and whatnot. And then similar to like Vent, Glimmer is going to be AoE. Like you're not going to find AoE with, unless you want to count spikes, but really you're not going to find just a flat spell that deals AoE damage later on in the run. So if you need that, lock it in early. Regen, now there obviously are other regen options, but they're not plentiful. You know, it's really just Awake and the what do you call it? The spores, spreading spores. And those are what I would label as like high investment cards. Like you have to really pour some upgrades into them or they're not going to be that good. Whereas like Wildwood Sap, I would say, is kind of middle of the road. It does enough without any investment to be good, but with investment it becomes great. So locking those in early, it also allows you to like hell vent it later on, maybe once or twice depending on how much regen you need. And then you're really locking in some nice boss killing potential there. And then also displacement, you know, there's not many cards like Vinegrasp in the game, and there's a few fights that you might want to just lock it in. Like if I'm against Talos, the pusher variant, the one that like pushes your units back, I kind of prioritize Vinegrasp unless I have a good reason to take something else, or if I just don't care about the pushback. But in a lot of cases, it can save your hide, like especially if you can permafrost that. If you have like a squishy Animus of Will in the back that is basically your only game plan to beat Talos, Vinegrass might be your only answer to be able to, like, after it gets pushed, to be able to just play it on your tank and move it forward. But these are the commons you're looking at here. I wouldn't say Sting's ever really something you need to lock in. Restoration, maybe. There's enough heals, I would say, that you don't really need to lock that in. But, you know, if you need Restore, it's there. Oh, and also spikes. Back real quick. There's this sharpen. You know, there's other ways to get spikes, but sharpen's like, you know, if you compare it to spreading spores, pyre shards, and cycle of life, which are the other ways to get spikes. I just think sharpen is easier to make work. You know, you don't have to put a consume stone on it. You don't have to have it like only give you spikes. Like it gives you the flexibility of putting damage down. It gives more spikes than all those other cards other than Pyre Shards, but Pyre Shards has its own problems of being like consumable and not really giving any offense beyond spikes. But so sharpen, you know, if, especially let's say you're somebody that really benefits from spikes, like the Hellhorn Prince, I would definitely lock in a sharpen if you see it, even if you didn't have Wrathful yet, because you might find it yet, right? And then now we're looking at the Stygian Guard, who luckily they're compared to the previous two clans, I would say you're not as strapped to find things early on because they're actually pretty balanced between the common, uncommon, and rare tiers in what their cards provide. Like you'll find cards that kind of do a lot of this at all tiers, but for what it's worth, you know, Offering Token is the only card that can actually allow you to choose which card you discard, so that could be a nice thing to lock in if you do have kind of an Incant build going on or already have like a Crypt Builder or Titan's Tooth. Also front-loaded damage, you're really only looking at Ancient Synergy or Pyre, I forget the name of it, but basically the one that does like 90 attuned damage to the top floor only, and those are both rares. So if you do, I usually do like to lock in some front-loaded damage, which would be these three cards, if I can find it. It'll definitely help with killing tanks. And then a little bit of a joke here, but I just said, you know, if you see these in your opener, you know, the ones that it just sort of shoves into your deck, maybe be aware that you'll need extra purges, because I think these cards are crap. But you know, just be aware that you probably have to hit up more wells than, or whatever their actual name is, Unstable Vortex, I think. Basically the map event that allows you to purge 2 cards for free. You might need to plan your routes to hit those if you really want to maximize like making your deck good, because I don't think too many good decks have Energy Siphon or Mollusk Mage in them, but that is just my personal opinion. There's obviously always a time and a place for every card in the game, so know that I'm being a bit sarcastic there. And the Umbra, this one I think is pretty important, and you know, this will intersect a bit with the Ember Drain guide that I put out. Shameless plug for that if you want to check that out. But if you do want to go the Ember Drain route, the easiest way it's going to happen is by locking in either Mind Collapse or Perils. Preferably Perils, but Mind Collapse works as well. And also, Immortal Trade doesn't like enable an Ember Drain build, but it kind of incentivizes you to, say, put like a Perils on holdover, because then like even if you don't find Void Binding or Furnace Tap, then at least you still have like the luxury of like maybe you can just make a unit that has endless lifesteal while still having energy, you know, something along those lines. But you know, check out the Ember Drain guide if you want more info on Ember Drain. Then also Morsel Generation. You will find Morsel or well, you won't. I don't want to say you will, but you can find Morsel Generation later on. You know, there's Gem Trove. There's the 2-cost that does 1 damage shield and does 2 morsels. Not sure, I can't remember the name of it right now, but so it's not like this is the only thing, but again, it's nice to lock these in because you're not going to find these particular morsel generators later on in the run. And honestly, I think Packed Morsels and Entumbra Assault are 2 of the best morsel generating cards in the game, so just knowing that you have those is pretty nice. Making of a morsel, not so much. I think it's pretty overcosted for what it does, but sometimes you just have to do it. I mean, Umbra is a clan where most of their banner units really don't work that well without morsels. And say you're the exiled version of Umbra, let's be honest, Plinks, they're not consistent. Any sort of trial, any lack of damage upgrades are just going to make them become useless by the time mid-game rolls around. And having something like Making of a Morsel to just sort of almost be a glorified Shade Splitter turns out to not be that bad of a thing if that's all you got, right? It'll make it, you can make it work. If you need Gorges, you need Gorges. And then also extra space. You can find Crucible Extenter later on. I just don't really find that to be as good as Space Prism, so I'd rather just have Space Prism as my extra space creator, and the knowledge that you can only really find it early on is worth noting, right? And then finally we got Melting Remnant here. Now there's definitely some things to take into mind here, like these 3 Burnout extension cards. You have the knowledge you're likely to find Burnout extension in the first 2 rings, so you can already start to try to plan around Burnout. But also you should know that if you don't have these, or if you got offered them and you've chose to skip them, you're not looking at too many options at Burnout extension later on, and even Reform, honestly. But nothing that gives you this much Burnout is ever found past the common tier. You know, Waxen Spike only gives you 1 Burnout, at least at the time of making this video. Maybe they redo that card at some point, because I think a lot of people complain about it. I could see them making the X cost actually apply Burnout, but you know, for what it's worth, right now it only gives 1 Burnout, and then beyond that there's really nothing. You know, you've got banner units, but again, banner units only get offered up, as I mentioned, up until ring 4, so past ring 4, if you don't have Lady of the Reformed, that's not going to work. And then really past that, all you got is, you know, 2 rare cards, the Waxen Spike, as I mentioned, just 1 Burnout, and then the Wickless Recruitment, which will remove your Burnout, which in some cases may not even work for what you're looking to do. But it's worth noting that if you want Burnout extension, especially something like Firelight Little Fade would really love it, you better lock them in when you see it. And the same for Molded on Reform. You can find 2 additional Reform cards in the game at the uncommon tier. That's going to be Sacred Wicks, which is a random Reform, and a Consume card, so not super reliable. And then Wickless Blaze. Wickless Blaze. Why does that sound wrong when I say it? But I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. Which is a 2 cost, and does give it does have targeted Reform and gives plus 10 damage, but it's an uncommon, so I don't know, you may or may not find it. So yeah, if Reform is like a thing, like if you chose Burnout Rector, for example, you should definitely target Molded pretty highly if that's your game plan. And then also the ability to overstack a floor. Dripfall can do that. You'll be dazed for a turn, but that's not too bad. But past that tier, yeah, you can't do it. Dripfall is your only option there. And I could even say like Seraph counter here, because actually Dripfall and Holdover is pretty decent counter to Seraph the Patient. But that's also an overlapping guide. Check out my Seraph guide if you haven't done that. And then also Harvest. There are other options at Harvest. Draft can almost fall into Harvest as well in a way, but being able to lock in these tombs early on is pretty nice, because really you're only looking at like Remnant Host past that, in my opinion, which is obviously the toppest of tier Harvest units, but you're not always going to find it. You might as well, if you have like Harvest Rector, I'd highly prioritize all 3 of these, honestly, if I saw them. Entombed Explosive especially, in my opinion, pretty nice with Harvest Rector. Takes care of some of those early tank issues that are hard to deal with. Gives you a free harvest on both ends, and that's a pretty good deal. And then also, oh yeah, I basically already mentioned this, but let's reiterate it. So after the Flying Boss, by the way, Ring 3, Daedalus, Talos, those are flying bosses. A flying boss is different than like a Ring 1 or 2 boss, which sort of just come in right at the end and then go up all 3 floors. Flying boss is present at every single wave, and you can hit them. Sometimes they can hit you. Also, Ring 6, Arcus, Fel, and then obviously Seraph. Those are all the flying bosses at the moment in the game. But anyway, when you beat the flying boss at Ring 3 or 6, you're going to get offered a rare. It could be from either clan. So it's not as predictable as the uncommons are, where it's like you're guaranteed like one pack from one clan, one pack from another clan. This one pulls from both pools, so it's I'm not going to go over the same breakdown that I just did because I didn't think it was probably worth the time to do so, but you can still make similar type predictions. You can be like, well, okay, my chances aren't necessarily that high to get any particular rare I'm looking for, so maybe I should game plan around a few rares being offered here. But again, just like the commons, it's going to be 8 choices per clan at the rare tier. Also, that you can use that to your advantage. There's that one cavern event. There's actually 2 cavern events where you can get a rare offering from a specific clan. So if you know in the back of your mind, or maybe even in maybe you just have a reference sheet somewhere, you can pull up 8, what the 8 rare choices are to see what your likelihood is to get any amount. Like if you sometimes I find it at least maybe not even until the last like month of play, I was pretty lost knowing which rare to choose from, and I would just be like, I don't know, I'll do Umbra because there's Furnace Tap or something. But like knowing all the choices gives you a better spread of what you're going to find, and if you know exactly what the spread is, it makes it pretty likely for you to get something that you might need if you know what you're looking for, right? And oh yeah, and then the banner units also have their own rarities. Only uncommon and rare. There's no common banner units. But I find that this the rarity with the banner units functions more like I would expect, like quote unquote rarity to be. Like you're never guaranteed like an uncommon pick. You're never guaranteed a rare pick. Simply rare is just more rare to find, and uncommon is technically pretty common because they're always guaranteed. So really it's just like, I would just call them common and rare if I were to actually name those. But, for what it's worth, they're blue, so technically uncommon. Anyway, that is neither here nor there. Each clan has 2 rare banner units, with Melting Remnant again being the exception here because they have Bounty Stalker, which can be offered at banner units and can at banner offerings, but also can be offered throughout the entire game. So that's one nice thing about Melting Remnant. They're the only one that can actually find a banner unit later on in the game that they might need. So it's worth noting that if you're looking for that Hail Mary, you might find it. Anyway, though, so the knowledge that each clan only has 2 rares isn't necessarily that important, but it is good to know which ones the rares are, because it's less likely you're going to find them. And they're generally pretty good. Some of them are actually pretty bad, I'd say, but they're generally pretty good. Like Deranged Brute, to me, is just hands down the best Hellhorn unit. Knowing that you're probably not going to find it makes you able to game plan a little bit better. Same goes for something like a Lodestone Totem or whatnot. But that is that. Now we're on to number 3, and I promise starting soon these are going to start flying through a lot faster. But like I said, the first few here are the most important, so figured I'd spend the most time on them. Now we're going to talk about champions. So at the start of each game, you're randomly going to be offered between 2 of the 3 possible paths available. So, take for example, the Sentient, the first Awoken champ, the non-exiled version, kind of the big shield girl, plant girl. You're going to get offered between one of the 3 paths there, so it's going to be Restore, like Restoration Bomb, Spikes, or the Cultivate. Cultivate/Draw Cards path. It's random. You never know what you're actually going to get offered. As far as I know, there's no weight to getting a certain path offered at the start more than the others, though I could swear to you, don't quote me on this, don't take me at face value on this, but I swear that Cold Channel is offered less for Soulguard. I'm just going to throw that out there. Maybe I'd like to hear what you all think about that, but that's been my experience. Anyway, that is neither here nor there. So, lock in one of those, and then basically those flying bosses that we talked about. After each of those in the map that follows, you're going to get to upgrade your champion again. And you'll always be offered the same path that you started with. And then it's a 50% chance on what the other path is going to be. It's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed to be the one that you saw at the start. It's not guaranteed to be the one you didn't see at the start. Just always going to be a 50-50 there. Now, important to note here, though, is that if you do lock in that second choice, you know, if you basically split your path to the other path now, you're never going to see the third one in that run. Whereas if you just stick with your initial path, on the final upgrade, you still have that 50% chance to see the other option, and that's good information to know. If you're trying to hold out for a specific upgrade, often I'm doing this with something like Primordium. Like if my favorite thing, like if I'm Primordium with an Awoken secondary, is I love to do Superfood with Stalwart. I like to combine the two of them. So if I find one of them at the start, and then I see like aggressive offered at the first upgrade, I usually try to hold out. Not saying aggressive is bad, by the way. Aggressive is plenty good, but just giving an example there. But that's good to know, right? Like if you are, Soul Guard's another one where it's like, I really don't like the Dire Channel path, so I try to avoid it if I can. I really want to hold out for Cold Channel usually. But you know, just knowing that is pretty good information if you didn't, right? And then onto our next one here, we got map choices. So this was mainly just I wanted to say which ones allow you to back out and which ones don't. Because this is actually pretty important to actually planning out your map, how you visit a map out. You know, if you see a cavern event and a specific shop or something, or maybe even a hell vent, the thing you got to know is on these must make choice ones, you can't back out of them. You visit it and you either have to like skip the choice or make a choice. And so like a lot of the times you'd be better off like checking shops in particular. These ones, the well and the hell vent allowing you to back out is just kind of a nice to have. There's not really any reason to like open it up and then back out, but it's nice that they allow you to back out of those. I just figured it was worth mentioning. But really just the shops that you can back out of, like the fact that you can do that is often very beneficial to check the shop first, see which upgrades are available, and that will inform the decisions that you make down here. Especially and in some cases you also want to purchase things at the shop, particularly in the event of caverns. My general rule, I'll have another guide around caverns at some point here that'll go over this in more depth, but my general rule is if it's Merchant of Steel, I like to buy my upgrades before I visit the cavern. The only cavern that really punishes you on is the Spike Driver event, and that only shows up in the third ring anyway. So you can maybe just make an exception if it's a third ring. But beyond that, I'd say it's generally better to lock in if you can get like 2 upgrades already, 2 good upgrades on a unit that like a priority banner unit. Then when you hit these caverns up, you can basically, and I'll get this is another point I have later on, but you can basically overstack the upgrades on your units. So like if you see like, oh, here's a choice to like give 25 HP to a unit, you can give that to a unit that already has 2 upgrades, and then you're getting a lot of value out of that cavern. Or similarly like a microstone, something like that. But you know, just in general, try to plan it out accordingly. If you want to see maybe sometimes I like to see my artifact first before I start making choices on hell vents, because like maybe I get something that really makes X cost cards good, right? And then now I want to hell vent an X cost. Just things like that. Plan your route out, know which ones you can back out of or not. Banner units as well. You want to definitely visit like a Merchant of Steel before you visit your banner unit. But we are on the next slide already, so you know, I'll leave you with that. Now we're on to the collector. Real quick, just the breakdown. Ring 1 to 2, it only has 1 HP, so basically anything in the game kills it, gives you 50 gold. Then so on and so forth. 3 HP, 75 gold. 3 HP, you're still killing it with most things, like a Vinegrass still kills it. Ring 7, 5 HP. Now we're talking, you probably need some sort of a significant thing to kill it, like, you know, Vinegrass isn't going to kill it anymore. Unupgraded, like, Glimmers aren't going to, I mean, they weren't going to do it there either, but, you know, and this one's worth 100 gold. And just a few things to know. If you can't get to it, there's ways to get around it, right? Because it is kind of important to get those collectors. That's a lot of gold you're just throwing out the door. I'll often sacrifice Pyre health or even the potential of like almost losing just so I can get that collector. But anyway, just a few facts about that. Intent on Death. Should have put the card art there so that people know what card I'm talking about. But that is the card for the Melting Remnant. It's a rare card that basically it's a 2-cost, and it says trigger the extinguish effect on a unit. Well, what you don't often realize about Intent on Death is you can play it on an enemy unit, and it'll trigger that effect. And since this effect of giving you gold is an extinguish effect, you can play that on Collector, and it'll give you the gold. And it won't even die. So if you're killing her already, you can double up on the gold. That's 200 gold at ring 7, even more if you have 2 Intent on Deaths that turn. I mean, that's a yikes amount of gold. You could even Intent on Death, and then, as our next points say here, can be preserved via root or dazed. So if you have a way to daze them or root them, they'll stick around for a turn, and you can just keep on doing the Intent on Death. You could theoretically do an infinite like gold loop on her if you really wanted to. Well, if you really could, we should say. We'd obviously all want to, but if you really can, is probably the better term to say there, for the record. And then counts as Slayer Harvest triggers. That's probably maybe pretty obvious, but I figured it was worth pointing out. You know, you can still get, say, a set of spikes for Little Icarus, or some extra stats for Wickless Baron, or some extra gold. That big old 5 gold from Wickless Tycoon. Worth noting. Then only spawns in the top and middle floor. I think most people realize this after a while, but I don't know. I've missed so many obvious things in this game. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. Luckily, none of you have to admit anything that you may or may not have noticed, but it is worth noting that it only spawns on the top or middle floor. You're never going to see that on the bottom floor, and that might inform your turn 1 setup. Like you might, especially on the higher Covenant levels, past 10, I think, you get dazed on the top floor. So you might really want to like put down, especially if you don't have any like damaging spells, like you might want to place like a Train Steward at the very top, or just some unit at the very top to like have that 50% chance to kill the Collector if it does spawn in there. It's going to save you a lot of gold, and it's an easy thing to miss. Like that's one of the easier misplays that you can make in the game, is just missing the Collector from dumb stuff like that. Not saying that I've never done it before, but it is worth pointing out. You know, this is also worth pointing out. I've done it a few times. It may not be that obvious, but you can ascend it. If it's on the top floor, you can put it right up to the Pyre to have the Pyre kill it. You know, hidden passage, tireless climb, the crane, siren song, even anything that ascends, you can do that to let it die. And that is all I got on the Collector. Now we're going to go on resolution order, and this one's going to be hard for me to talk about. I wanted to do like a video on this specifically. Maybe I will one day, but it's a lot of work, let's put it that way. So I'll try my best to explain what I mean here. So enemy resolutions will occur left to right. So, you know, their frontliners are toward the center of the map. Their backliners are over to the right. And then for us, our units, it's going to be right to left. So same thing. Our first people to act are going to be toward the center of the map. Then the last to act are going to be the very left of the map. Action triggers when it's the unit's turn to attack. So action, that's not a whole lot of units have this, but like a great example would be the Shardtail Queen with Imperialist Route. So that's the Shardtail Queen path that allows you to explode imps on your floor in an AoE fashion for a bunch of AoE damage. So that occurs as they attack. That's something I think can get lost in the mix. So, you know, for example, let's say that you placed an imp in front of you and it's going to survive. That imp will attack, and then when the Shardtail attacks, that imp will explode and then do the AoE. If you put the imp behind your Shardtail, so let's pretend this Primordium here is Shardtail, you know, this was the imp, but instead I put it behind, back here, it will not attack. It will be exploded before it gets to attack, because of that order, the Shardtail will you know, attack, but before it attacks, it triggers her action. And we're also assuming that they're not on the top floor like we see here. They're not dazed because, as I will get to in later points, the dazed just is going to prevent actions from happening. But anyway, it's also worth noting that the quick tome, or just if the unit has quick and has action, totally functions with this. So let's say often it's kind of annoying when you're facing sweeping units, say like a Pyre Wing or whatever it's called, the unit that like Ember drains you and sweep attacks you. Very annoying to have your 1 health HP, your 1 HP imps in the back get swept, and then you don't get to do any of your Imperialist procs, right? However, if you put quick on your Shardtail, because she's attacking before the enemy, remember, action, it's not, I would say the text isn't even that clear, but it says like on your turn. Really, it's on your attack, because if you put quick on him and attack, you'll notice it will explode those imps before the sweep ever gets a chance to go off. So I figured that was a pretty non-obvious interaction, at least to me, that was worth pointing out. I didn't know that for a long time. And to be honest, I didn't even really understand the ordering of the action for a long time. But it doesn't just apply to Shardtail. There's enemies that have it too, like Daedalus's grenade has it. So if you can do things like March of Shield it to the front if it makes sense to like get it to explode first and like kill a chump blocker or something like that. But yeah, and also it's also worth noting the order on top of all that is attacks always go first, and there's no Gorges on the enemy side, so that doesn't matter. So this is really just talking about our side at this moment. But your attacks go off first, and when all attacks are done, the Gorges will happen. So whatever your frontliner is gets every Gorge, every Morsel unit or Primordium will get eaten at that point. And then, only then, after all that happens, does the status and buff resolutions occur. And it's also worth noting those also occur in a front to back fashion. And that can be somewhat important sometimes. Like, so to use an example, this is where I really wish I had the time to like do a video, but we'll just have to imagine. So imagine that there is that this Demon Fiend has Burnout 1, and imagine that there is a Wickless Baron behind it, and then there's this let's just say it's a Primordium. Because the Gorge happens first, the Burnout 1 Demon Fiend will get the stats from Primordium and then just die. So you kind of wasted that Gorge. However, if you had put him behind, then you can put the Gorge on Wickless and not actually waste the Gorge, because then that unit just burns out, and you get it on the unit. And that also is the reason why this I think is why I screenshotted this example. In this example, it's Superfood Primordium. So that every effect and buff and debuff gets transferred to the frontliner when they Gorge. So a very common interaction you'll see with that is you put both units turn 1 in on the top floor, and then turn 2 your frontliner will still be having Dazed 1. And the reason that is because the Gorge happens first, so this Dazed now stacks to 2 here, and then after that the stat buff resolutions occur, so the 2 then goes down to a 1, and the 1 here just goes away because it goes down to a 0. That is why if you do a Retch later on and you put the Primordium in to the top again, that is why your frontliner doesn't actually ever end up Dazed, because even though the Retched Primordium Superfood will come back in and get that Dazed, it is gonna, once it Gorges, it just transfers the 1. Since there wasn't already the 1 there, it then just resolves that Dazed immediately as it got transferred. So it's actually pretty nice in that effect, but it can also work against you in the case of Burnout. So if you think of Burnout, if you had 1 Burnout here and no Burnout here, it will transfer that 1 Burnout first on the Gorge, and then the resolutions happen after that. So actually it'll just immediately make the unit burn out and die. So those are things that are worth noting, right? That if you know the basics of that, you're going to be able to plan out some pretty fancy turns, especially with things like Superfood Primordium. And that will often allow you to get through those sort of edge of knife situations where the run could go either way depending on how perfectly you play. Now we're going to talk about morsels. Speaking of gorging, you'll often see in the description of whatever your morsel generating card is that you might get a common or an uncommon or a rare morsel, which wasn't always obvious to me what that even meant. But this is actually, if you look at the actual cards, you'll see the rarity, and what you'll notice is there's really just one card in the common tier, and then one card in the rare tier, and then everything else is an uncommon. So, it's just Rubber Morsel in the common tier, then everything else is uncommon, and then Morsel Minor and rare. And on top of that, it's also maybe not so common, or not so obvious, but I have basically ran enough tests to confirm this. Say you have a card that says it generates common and uncommon morsels, or uncommon, I should say. There's a heavy weight to it being a common morsel. So that's why things like Shade Splitter and Plink almost always, way more often than not, give you a rubber morsel. It's not just because you got bad luck. I mean, you probably have bad luck, but it's not just because you have bad luck. It is legitly weighted much more to have the rubber morsel be it. And the same goes for any card that does just uncommons and rares. You're not going to see Morsel Minor as much, but that's fine, because honestly I find like these two right here to typically be better than a Morsel Minor anyway. And also it's worth noting, this didn't always used to be the case, and I should have mentioned this at the start, but I'll mention it now. Everything I say in this guide is subject to patch changes. In the past, when you would eat a morsel, it would count as a harvest, both for the enemy and you, so that was good and bad depending on what your setup was. But as of the current patch, no, morsels eaten do not count as harvests, so you don't have to worry about things like Overcharged Tank, which is already an awful unit, just being even more awful when you're eating morsels. But obviously, if they die, it still counts as a harvest. And not only that, it'll add it to things like your reform pool and whatever else death interactions have, right? But here's this final point I have here. I think is the most overlooked and least the least common knowledge, I would say. You can slap Endless on a non-summoned, that's in star there, because I'll get to this later too, but like summoned morsels function a little bit differently than like ones that you created from a card. What I mean by summon is like, say like Morsel Maker, the 2-cost one that just automatically spits out morsels without having any cards needed to play. Those are summoned morsels. Those will not get added to your reform pool when they die, and they will also not be able to do this endless trick. But say you created a morsel with like a Shade Splitter or an Entumbra Assault or Plinks, actual cards of morsels, those, when you play them down, you can slap Endless on them, and not only will they come back when dead, because that's the obvious interaction, right? But this is the big thing I did not expect to happen, is that they will also come back when eaten. So say you have say you're like really struggling for whatever reason to find like some sustain or defense. An option for you could be to like find a lifeless or lifesteal morsel or a damage shield morsel. You can slap Endless on it, and you're going to be guaranteed to gorge and get either of these back into your hand every single turn. That may not be a pretty good thing for you. And also, it's worth noting, same with Primordium. You can slap Endless on a Primordium, and even if it doesn't die, if it just gets all of its gorge stacks consumed, it'll come right back into your hand, fresh and ready for a whole new round of consuming. So Endless Tome, pretty good with morsels and Primordium, if I do say so myself. Now, a few things on Burnout and Reform. I can't get into everything here because there's so much you can go over with this, but we'll start with the basics. Any unit that dies in combat, or this is probably something that's not that well known. It wasn't well known to me. consumed in your hand via Sacrificial Resurrection. Sacrificial Resurrection is that card that Melting Remnant has that basically you play it and it just consumes every card in your hand and adds like 10 damage to a newly created draft for every card consumed. It's if you consume a unit card in your hand, it actually counts as dying and it puts it into your reform pool. That is a pretty non-obvious interaction, if I do say so myself. And not only that, it can bypass the Endless effect on a card, because Endless, remember, it only works if you play the card. So the craziest interaction I see with this is you can do that on a Endless Little Fade. You know, the Endless version of Little Fade that basically keeps costing an additional Ember and getting a bunch of stats every time it dies. You can do that to bring it back down to a 0 cost. Granted, it'll have Burnout at this point, but if that's not an issue for you, you just found a way to like get it to 4 or 5 cost and have it be able to be played for a 0 cost now the following turn. But you know, beyond that, you can do it with any Endless card, so it's interesting. It's also worth knowing so you don't like bite yourself in the ass by doing it. Sometimes you don't want to do that to your Endless cards, right? Like put Burnout on them. That can be pretty bad sometimes. Anyway, though, I thought that was pretty interesting. Summoned units do not enter the reform pool. So I was talking, you know, morsels created by Morsel Maker, or even like the drafts that are created when a remnant host dies. Those are summoned units. That's why you don't see them come back into the reform pool. Or, you know, you're not allowed to like put Endless on them. If you try to click them with Endless, with the Endless tome, it just says it doesn't work, basically. I forget what exactly it says, but it basically says, nope, not allowed. Oop. Yeah, Burnout, I mentioned this in the resolution order, but it's probably worth reiterating that the Burnout occurs right to left. So say you got a Wickless Baron, say it has Burnout, and there's another unit, say it has 1 Burnout, and you have another unit that, say you have a draft and it has 1 Burnout. If you place the draft in front, it'll die first in the Burnout order, and the harvest will occur for Wickless, so it gets those stats, and when you reform it, you'll have those extra stats. However, if you place a draft behind, Wickless will die first and not get the harvest of the dying draft from Burnout. So that's worth noting if that's something that matters. Sometimes it does. And also on reform, the Burnout, it only cares about the inherent Burnout on a card. So like say like most cards just don't have any inherent Burnout. So when they die, it just takes the inherent Burnout of 0 and increases it by 1 to make it 1. That's why the first reform kind of sucks a lot of the times on some of these cards. But it doesn't matter if you had put Wicklash on it, for example, or you know, through any means necessary, basically applied Burnout during the round to this unit. It doesn't care about that once it dies. Once it dies, it only cares about what its inherent Burnout value is. Same goes for like if you did Wickless Recruitment and remove the Burnout. It's still going to come back with whatever the inherent Burnout amount is if it dies. And in a similar note, any sort of buffs or just debuffs or stat changes like giving it multi-strike or giving it trample, those also will not persist on reform. Only the stats, the base stats, you know, not any stats gained from rage or anything, just the base stats. That's what retains. And then obviously you gain like 5 and 5 just naturally on reform. So that's worth noting. It's one of the reasons why I don't find the Soul Guard and Melting Remnant having a whole lot of synergy, because obviously those shards are a yellow effect, similar to like Burnout and Multi-Strike here, where those shards just don't retain when you reform. So there's like kind of a lack of synergy there in that sense specifically. Then it's worth probably talking about Primordium a bit more here. So Superfood in particular has a lot of weird interactions. So it only transfers base stats though. And I said superfood, but really that's any version of Primordium. They only transfers the base stats, does not transfer like the attack gained from rage or lost by sap. So, you know, if I had a rage here, say I had 1 rage, the attack would read 5 here, but only 3 gets transferred here. Similarly, if I had sap, 1 sap, and I only have 1 attack, it still transfers 3 when it gets gorged over to the unit. And I will say that that is a little bit, I don't want to say inconsistent, but that's the word I'm going to use. It is inconsistent with how adaptive mutation functions. And I'll have another screen on this, but just a spoiler alert, adaptive mutation, that's the awoken card that swaps your attack. It heals you to full and then swaps your attack and HP. With that, it takes into factor any damage gained from rage or lost from sap. So it was a bit confusing to me figuring that interaction out, but it's worth noting that it is the exact opposite from how adaptive mutation handles that particular transferring of stats. And then, but also, you know, superfood in particular, it transfers the buffs, so you know, the green stuff, the debuffs, the red stuff, but also the yellow effects. So that was an interesting one. Obviously not this yellow effect, not the fact that it has 8 stacks of Gorge left, but anything else it will transfer over. Burnout, Trample, Multi-Strike, any of that, it will get transferred over. Which allows you to do things like stack a ton of Multi-Strike, which is just hilarious. That's one of my favorite things to do with Superfood. And another, I don't think super obvious interaction is that it will also transfer the armor. Only Superfood does this, not the other versions of Primordium, but armor will get transferred. So if you put, say, an alloy, give it 25 armor, every single turn it will transfer that 25 armor to your front liners. So that's pretty nice too, huh? And then also, it is returned on Retch. So, you know, Retch, it returns all those morsels. If you were to eat the Primordium fully, it will come back with Retch. So that's worth noting. It's a nice out if you don't have Stalwart stacks. And then Endless, I've mentioned this with the Morsels already, but you can put an Endless Tome on it, and whether it dies, whether it gets eaten fully, doesn't matter. It's coming back to your hand once it's dead or eaten. I guess eaten counts as dead in the case of Endless. Kind of inconsistent. You know, maybe they change that at some point, but that is how it functions right now. And then also it's worth noting that the consume obviously happens after the attack round, as we've outlined before, but before those status effects resolve. So I kind of mentioned before the interaction of why turn 1 if you play both units, turn 2 the unit will be dazed, but if you bring it back with Retch later on, it does not get dazed. Unless, of course, it's already dazed that turn. Then it happens. But that is, I basically already explained this, so I'm not going to explain it again. But if you want it in written form, there it is. Go ahead and pause it and internalize it. And you can use that to your advantage with many other buffs and debuffs and status effects in the game. And then we're talking about Dazed now. Dazed, we already mentioned the collector interaction. You can use it to basically stop it for a turn and maybe find a way to kill it the next turn. But in truth, it's the reason that it happens that way. It's not unique to the collector necessarily. It's really just because the collector, it leaves the battle on resolve. And Dazed, what it does is it stops any unit from resolve from actually resolving, and also actions, because as we've mentioned, action occurs when they would attack. So Dazed will prevent both of those. So you can prevent a grenade from exploding if it's dazed, you know, one of Daedalus's grenades. You can prevent a Scourge Shuffler from shuffling a Scourge into your deck. I find it really useful for that, to be honest. That saves you a draw the next turn. It saves you potential Pyre health, potential Ember. It's pretty good to like daze one of those units if you can't kill it. All the better if you can stack a few dazed on it. But anyway, this also applies to your own units too, though. Like Morsel Maker, I've bashed this unit a lot. I will say I I still use the unit a lot in Umbra. I don't want to bash it too much, but one of the things I really don't like about it is this particular interaction, because Morsel Maker only creates the morsels on resolve, but remember, resolve happens after gorging, so not only do you not gorge the turn you play it, if you're dazed, not only you're not going to gorge it the turn you play it, you're not even going to make morsels that turn, and then you have to wait till the next turn to even make a morsel. And then the turn after that, 2 entire turns before you can even see the morsel on the map, much less gorge it. So definitely an interaction worth noting. And it also means you can't do things like the Shardtail Imperialist, because as we've mentioned, action also is not going to count. So that is mainly, it can be an issue with some Markham invasions, but I find it more of an issue with the Arcus shards, where they daze your units on rally. It kind of screws over Imperialist Shardtail. You're guaranteed to get screwed over on at least one turn if you're really relying on those Imperialist procs, because there's just nothing you can do there. But yeah, definitely worth noting. But other thing, you know, it's also worth noting what still works when you are dazed, like Incants and Revenge. They'll work just fine when you're dazed. You can be dazed 20 times and you'll still be able to incant to your heart's content, or like a Titan Frost Shark or whatever does not care about being dazed. It's going to still apply frost all left and right as it's getting hit. And I did mention this already, but dazing Scourge Shufflers is a great way to prevent their Scourge Shuffling effect. Highly recommend doing that if you can. Also, dazing these flying bosses, it's not going to prevent their effects, I put in quote. I don't know what else to really call it, but it's like Daedalus will drop down a grenade. It's not going to stop him from doing that. It will stop Talos, though, from striking you, obviously. So in that sense, it's pretty nice against Talos, but it's not going to stop Arcus from dropping shards. It's not going to stop Fel from like applying rage or shuffling scourges. It's not going to stop Seraph the Chaste from removing your buffs. It's not going to stop it'll stop Seraph the Patient from attacking you, but it's not going to stop him from applying melee weakness. So that's what I mean by effects. It's not going to stop those. Unfortunately. Trust me, I wish it did. And then we're on to Restore. Any attempt to heal, whether it be from regeneration proc, heal spell, lifesteal, anything that attempts to like give you health back, right? Will trigger a restore proc. So anything that triggers on restore, like the Restoration Bomb path of why can't I remember her name now? Sentient. The Awoken Champ Sentient has a on restore proc. So anytime it gets healed, anytime that regeneration ticks, anytime it tries to lifesteal, if it has some attack, it will trigger that restore proc, even if you're already at full HP. So you can play Glimmer on you. You're already at full HP. It'll do the AOE, and then it'll also just throw out a restore bomb in that case. Or like Thorned Hollow, it will give him two spikes then, even if he's at full health. Now it's worth mentioning something like Cycle of Life does not count for this, because it's not technically healing you. It's just giving you max HP. It's manipulating your stats, not actually a heal. Now it is worth distinguishing though that something like the Restoration Detonation, that card that heals you for 10 HP and then deals 50 times that the damage healed, that needs actual healing to occur, like healing of lost health. Otherwise, it's not going to apply any of that damage. It'll still trigger a restore if you're at full health, but it's not going to trigger the effect of throwing that damage out. Same with like Priory's Cloak. It needs actual HP to be restored to actually do that damage. And then Edge Prior, not a unit I really use, but I figured it was worth calling out that it only reduces the costs on spells that do actually apply a heal that turn. So something like Wildwood Sap doesn't even help it. It doesn't help spreading spores. It only does things like Glimmer that actually do a heal that turn. So That's too bad. I kind of wish they didn't have it that way. Maybe it might find more use if it could actually, do that. Maybe spreading spores would be pretty good with Edge Prior in that case, but maybe that changes one day, but at the time of this guide, not the case. Sap Tap also is a nice example of restore proc. That'll just occur on any unit as long as you just do a heal, any form of it, full health or no, it's going to get that card draw, so that's pretty nice. And then Adaptive Mutation. We had touched on this, but it's worth calling out a few interactions here. So unlike the Superfood Primordium, it does take into account the attack gained or lost via buffs and debuffs, so Rage and Sap mainly. So for example, say you have 10 base attack and 5 HP. I kind of already went over all this, but and you have 2 Rage applied, so now you have 14 attack. Playing Adaptive Mutation on this unit will result in the unit now reading 9 attack and 14 HP. That's because it still has the Rage, but then the 14 HP is because it took into account the extra attack given by Rage and then just gave it permanently to your health. So completely inconsistent with Superfood, but that is how it is currently. Maybe that changes one day, we'll have to see. It also has a by the way, though, let's not just gloss over that fact. You can use this greatly to your effect, particularly with a lot of units in the game, honestly. Almost every clan other than, ironically, every clan other than Awoken has good ways to get Rage. Like Nameless Siren has super easy time getting Rage. Hellhorn obviously has a million ways to give Rage. Umbra used to have more ways to get Rage, but they still have Void Binding and Perils, so still decent amount of Rage. And the Melting Remnant has both Sludge Boss and Paraffin Enforcer. If you stack a pretty good amount of Rage, the amount of health that Adaptive Mutation gives you is not insignificant at all. Like, you can turn a Nameless Siren into a 300 HP tank that still does 300 damage, So it's I didn't want to necessarily gloss over this first point. If you weren't aware of that interaction, you should definitely hammer it home because it is a very powerful interaction. And then it's also worth noting that it has a weird interaction with the Awoken Hollow. Awoken Hollow is a great, if you're using Awoken Hollow as a backliner, it's already just a great target for Adaptive Mutation. Because remember, it has like 60 extra health that's just empty from the get-go, but you can heal that and just turn it into damage. So Adapt is almost always good with that anyway, but it has a weird interaction when you try to reform it, I've noticed. If you played Adaptive on it first and then reform it after, it dies. For whatever reason, it just comes back with 1 HP. It's really weird, and I've tried to figure out why, and I honestly can't explain why it is. I don't know if it's intended or not, but I will say this is how it functions. So maybe they change that eventually. Maybe one day I'll be able to explain it. I've even talked with other kind of people about it, and we'll think we have it figured out, and then we're like, wait, no, that doesn't make sense. Like, nothing actually makes sense to me why that happens, but it is worth noting that is what happens. And card draw and hands, so both Endless and Holdover, are going to cost a draw the following turn. In other words, you don't get that card in addition. So say I'm drawing 5 cards a turn. One of those 5 cards drawn will, if I have played a card that was on Holdover or Endless, is gonna be that card. It's not like you get that card and also draw 5 cards, if that makes sense. Could be non-obvious. Just something to think about. Like, as good as Holdover and Endless are, if you have too many cards on Holdover and Endless, that can really hurt your ability to dig through your deck if you don't have much draw. It's just definitely worth noting, and it can screw you over sometimes. And sometimes you may purposely just not want to play something that's Endless or on Holdover, specifically so that you can draw through your deck and try to find a card sometimes. And Endless units, it's a little different how Endless and Holdover function. So the Endless units, they'll get shuffled right back to the top of your draw pile immediately when they die, which means if you have a card a card or artifact that draws a card that turn still, if you can self-kill the unit, it'll bring it right back. And you can use that to your advantage, or you can avoid it to try to not have it happen, right? Sometimes, like, If you have a welder helper on Endless, for example, sometimes maybe you want to play important work on it so that you get another set of armor, just so you can just replay it immediately. Or sometimes you may want to use it on a different imp that's not Endless, because maybe you actually do want to try to dig through your deck for a different card at that point. So it's worth noting that. It also can set up some Endless shenanigans sometimes, but I'll have a guide on Endless, on like just all my known and like infinites. That's another time, another place. So, and then Holdover is different though. Holdover, those are like on the spell cards. It doesn't actually put it to the top of your deck like that. Like it, when it, here, hold on one sec. All right, sorry about that. Anyway, where was I? So we're talking about holdover on the cards. So it's different because it doesn't just come to the top of your deck. It'll sit in your discard pile. So if you have an Endless, in the previous example, let's say your Important Work card. Important Work, by the way, is a card that you just target one of your own imps and it sacrifices them, gives you 2 energy, and draws a card. Just to clarify which card we're talking about here. But so Important Work, if that card is on Endless and then you play it to sacrifice an imp and draw a card, you're not going to just redraw into your Important Work. And in fact, once you play that and let's say you draw again, you're just not going to see it because it's not actually in your draw pile yet. It only puts it, it just takes it straight from your discard pile and draws it the next turn. That's how holdover functions kind of differently. Kind of non-obvious to me. That's like a little bit inconsistent. I think they do it to try to make infinites harder. That's best I can gather why that inconsistency is there. And then also the maximum, I said deck size, this should read hand size. The maximum hand size is 10, similar to like Slay the Spire. A lot of other card games, 10 seems to be the magic number. So if your hand is full, but you still have leftover like draw, say you're drawing 12 in a turn or something, you'll just draw 10, but the cards that you would have drawn, this functions, it functions a bit differently than it does in other games like Slay the Spire. Like in Slay the Spire, it would just take those cards that would have been drawn and then it would throw them right into your discard pile. That doesn't happen in Monster Train. In Monster Train, they'll remain in your draw pile and be available for future draws. They're not going to just pass over into your discard pile. Now, however, if your hand is full and you're trying to summon a card, so things like Thornfruit. Thornfruit is that awoken artifact that creates a sting every single turn. Or things like Imp in a Box. Those summoned cards just won't ever get created if your hand is full. So like Thornfruit, if you were relying on getting a sting, fortunately that sting is never coming about. It's not like put into your discard or draw pile. It just simply isn't created. And same thing with like Imp in a Box. Like if you have a hand size of, if your hand is already full and you play Imp in a Box first, you kind of misplayed because you're only going to get one imp, and that other imp that would have been created never gets created. Hopefully I'm clear on that, and hopefully that makes sense. And then, but in a different sense, if your hand is full and cards are returned to your hand, so think like Wretch and Reform, they're placed into your draw pile. So like if this happens with Wretch a lot, I find, like if you have a lot of morsels you've eaten, but you really want to get that Primordium back, you want to try to empty out your hand best you can, because you may not get Primordium back. Remember, it's kind of random how the gorged units are going to be returned. But the great thing about that is they don't just get like thrown to the ether like the summoned card situation happens. These actually will just get thrown into your draw pile, the ones that are kind of over the hand limit. So at least if you don't get the Primordium that turn, you'll probably find it the following turn. And I do apologize. I meant to find out if it actually puts them to the top of your draw pile. I think it does, but don't quote me on that. And also, I could have said this on the champion slide as well, but the champion, remember the champion that you start with, it technically costs a draw on turn 1. That may or may not be relevant, but it's worth noting. You know, it's along with the banner units costing a draw on turn 1, your champion will always cost a draw. So say you have your default draw size of 5. One of them, the guaranteed champion draw counts as one of them. So it's not like you get that and 5. It's going to count for one of your draws. May or may not factor in, like if you have a really thin deck and you're trying to do like some weird infinite stuff, that can be relevant sometimes. And then Scourges and Blights. When an enemy unit or effect first shuffles that Scourge into your deck, it's in a similar way to Holdover and Endless, it's going to cost a draw. It's not just putting it sort of in addition to your drawn cards. It actually costs you a draw to do it. So that's why it really kind of does hurt. Like it really hurts to let too many of these Scourges get shuffled into your deck, because you're just not going to have the ability to draw through your deck as fast if you let those guys live, or at the very least don't daze them or something, or silence them. But there's it's probably also worth differentiating between Scourges and Blights. The Scourges, those are temporarily consumable cards, so those are the things that just get shuffled in by like Fell, or those usually small health units that don't do a whole lot of damage, but just like Absolvers or whatever. They're going to shuffle in things that cost Ember to play, and if you don't play them, your Pyre will take damage. Aside from the Ring 2 ones. The Ring 2 ones don't actually hurt you, but still hurt your draw, which is, oddly enough, probably more annoying to me at least than the actual Pyre damage taken. But anyway, there's no real synergies for Scourge cards. However, the Blight cards do have synergies. There's several artifacts and also Dante which benefit from having Blights in your deck or being played, like Weathered Cold Stones that benefits from playing them. And it's worth noting which ones are Blights and which one, like when I first started the game, I always thought, oh, what's like a Blight? Isn't that just everything, right? But no, there is a difference. These are Scourges, and they're not going to gain any benefit. So don't like purposely let Scourges get shuffled into your deck thinking you're going to get some like Blight synergy, because you're not going to get that from Scourges. And it's also worth noting some of the Blights can be purged, but some can't. So like the Dante's Candles that get added, you can't ever get those out of the deck. Same with the Deadweights that start in your deck, or sometimes you can add them to your deck. Those can never be purged. But other things like the Vengeful Shards, these can actually be purged. Like there's a few events, cavern events, that will add these to your deck. And if you don't find that you need them anymore, you don't need the effect that they provided, you can just purge them for your deck. That's totally fine. I do that quite often. And also, obviously, the Calcified Embers can as well. Those are a bit more obvious, though, because you can simply play them. And also worth noting, Seraph the Diligent shuffles a few Vengeful Shards into your deck. Those do count to your Blight total, so it'll make Dante stronger. It'll allow you to use, the artifact that gives you those the cavern event that gives you the Calcified Embers that can be played to do damage. You can just play for 1 Ember these Vengeful Shards on the Diligent fight, and it'll do 100 damage. That's why I almost always take that event if I see Seraph the Diligent in my future. It's super useful to just take that event in that case. And then Razorsharp Edge, I really like this card, super versatile. I think if people don't like it, it's usually because they don't really realize the versatility of it. Real quick, just the basics of it. It lowers your max HP, but it also knocks 2 HP from the current HP. This isn't how it always functioned, but this is how it functions as of the current patch. So let's say you have 5 HP of 10 total remaining. If you play it, it'll now bring you down to 3 out of 8 total. It used to function differently. It used to just take your max down, but they changed it at some point to actually also bring just your current HP down, as if you were damaged. However, it doesn't count as a damage, oddly enough. And I think I mentioned that. Yeah, I mentioned that at the bottom here. So like things like Fragile, you can still play Razorsharp Edge on yourself, and it will not break your Fragile. Kind of non-obvious, but that is a good thing to note if you do need to like play Razorsharp Edge and scale out your Fragile unit. You're free to do so. But I think a big thing that is missed with this is the usefulness of being able to use it on enemies. You know, you can use it on enemies to kill them. And in the first 3 rings, this is highly useful. I would almost argue Razorsharp Edge, a good 50% of the time, should be being played offensively in the early game. It's so useful to just kill like a Daedalus grenade, particularly like a double exploder. It's better to just stop one of those, prevent 20 damage rather than scale out 10 of your own damage. You only really need to play it like once, maybe twice in your own units in the early game to get enough scaling out of it to kill pretty much any boss. But it's much more useful for just preventing damage on yourself or your pyre. Like you can, or even just getting a collector. I use it often just to kill a collector. But yeah, offensively, it's super useful in those first few fights, and even later on, I still use it a lot of the time. Like, because you gotta also remember, it does not care about damage shield, doesn't care about spell shield. It can go right through those things. So, if there's a unit that has 2 or less HP, go ahead and do it. It'll finish them off. Volatile Gauge. It's its own beast, right? And it's had several iterations throughout the time of this game, so we're only talking about the current iteration. But at this time, it does. It still gives the 3 benefit to draw, but it then randomizes all your cards drawn to be between 1 and 3 ember. Now, notice I put drawn in quotes here because that does not affect a few things. Like your initial champ draw is always going to still be 0. Summoned cards, like we talked about, like Imp in a Box creates cards. A lot of the morsel generation creations, like a making of a morsel, for example. All of those are not technically drawing the cards, they're like creating the card, so it's not going to actually randomize the cost in that case. Same goes for return cards from like Retch and Reform. Those are going to come back at cost, so to speak, not going to be randomized. But another non-obvious interaction that might make you more enticed to take this artifact, because I gotta be honest, when the latest nerf happened, I kind of wrote the artifact off for a little bit. But then I've played with it a lot in the last few months. It's still really powerful. But I'm kind of getting tangent here. Let's just say a lot of that comes from the fact that you can do things like this here. So, you know, you can go to Merchant of Magic. You're always guaranteed to be able to spend 25 gold on any reroll for that -1 Ember upgrade. And it actually still works with a Volatile Gauge in its own way. And the way that works is the randomization between 1 and 3, it will occur, and then the Ember reduction happens afterwards. So it essentially makes it so, like, you know, normally your possibilities of randomness are going to be 1, 2, and 3 as far as the Ember cost goes. If you were to put 1 Ember upgrade on that card, now it goes down to 0, 1, and 2. And similarly, if you put 2 Ember upgrades, it's now 0, 0, 1. So almost still always free. You can use this to really get some priority spells to almost always be cheap, which is pretty powerful. When you combine that with the fact that you're drawing so many cards each turn, you're just able to keep cycling into it and pretty much be guaranteed to play it. X costs function as normal. There's no initial 1 or 3 sort of applied to the X cost. But unfortunately, Scourges and Blights are affected because those are always drawn, right? They're not created. They can sometimes come in at 3, and that sucks. Definitely sucks to fight Scourgefell, and yeah, it's a sad day. But you know what? Good to know that it happens, so you're prepared for it. Now, X costs. X costs, they're interesting. For a lot of them, the first thing I'd like to note, a lot of people know this, but maybe newer players don't. I didn't initially know it really, but once I found it out, it made a lot of them so much more powerful to me. So like a great example is Vent. It does 2 times your Ember spent damage in an AoE fashion to the enemies. So, you know, you play it for 2, it'll do 2. If you play it for none, it's not going to do any. But let's say you just slap one of these cheap 25 gold plus damage upgrades on it. You know, either the one right pictured here, it's the one that gives the 20 and makes it consume. I typically like just plus 10 damage on it with no consume, even better, but either one will work. At that point, it now becomes a card that you can play for 0 Ember after you've already spent all your Ember, and you can play it and just get all that damage for free. And honestly, to me, it's weird how it functions. Like, it almost kind of defeats, in my opinion, the purpose of what X costs exist for. But as it stands, it just is, these X costs are so much more useful to just play at 0 Ember. Same goes for like Mind Collapse. Like, if you slap a +10 damage on it, you can now play Mind Collapse at 0, kill a unit that has 10 or less health, and get 2 Ember back. So on and so forth. A lot of X costs function this way. Well, they all do, but a lot of them get the huge benefit from just putting a flat damage upgrade to it. So that'll make cards like Vent and Mind Collapse just be so much more powerful once you know that you can just do that and play it at 0 cost to get a ton of damage out of them. And then similarly, well, not similarly, kind of similarly, this is not something that's always been the case, but however many patches ago, they changed the X cost mechanics so that the X cost cards can get Ember reductions applied to them. And in that case, you can go below the limit. So if you have, like pictured here, this Prismal Dust, I applied a 1 Ember upgrade to it. So not only, say I play it at 2, it'll give me 3 shield, but more importantly, I can play it at 0 and still get 1 damage shield out of it, which is pretty nice. Again, it makes it so these X cost cards can just be played at 0 to still get a nice benefit. And it is worth noting that Awoken Rail Spike, while it would still function that way itself, like I could play it at 0 with this upgrade to get a card drawn, the cards that it draws, it does not do this to if they are X cost. I find that a bit inconsistent. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes maybe someday in the future. But it is worth noting that, like, say I have a unupgraded Prismal Dust and I draw it with Awoken Rail Spike and I have no Ember left, it's not going to allow me to now play it at 0 and get 2 damage shield. I think it should, personally. I think it would be consistent that it does do that, but it's worth noting at this time, it does not do that. And then Gifts for a Guard, it has some pretty fun interactions. First off, it's really the only way to apply Consume to cards that don't deal damage. Because, at any Merchant of Magic, you can add the Surge Stone to a card and it'll add the Consume effect, but it only works on cards that actually deal damage already. There's also a Cavern event where you can basically purge a card that has damage, but only one that has damage. So Gifts is unique in that sense because it can add Consume to maybe some primitive molds or something and just thin out your deck in a way that nothing else in the game really can do other than like Sacrificial Resurrection. More importantly, though, you can build an entire game plan around Gifts for a Guard, particularly the fact that if you do have the Eternal Stone Merchant of Magic upgrade, which is basically the upgrade that it increases your Ember cost by 1, but removes the actual Consume effect on a card. Any card drawn by Gifts of a Guard doing talking for so long it's getting hard. So Gifts of a Guard, you draw a card, it applies Consume, it gives it magic power, reduces the cost to 0. If it draws a card that has this upgrade right here, that's the Eternal Stone upgrade, it can't actually remove the Consume in that case because this upgrade protects against that. So like this, for example, this Ice Tornado, it gets that plus damage applied, goes to 0, and it can get played, but it does not Consume in this case because it has that upgrade. That will then allow you to continue playing Gifts for a Guard on future turns and continuing to just permanently increase the damage during that fight for Ice Tornado. And eventually your deck will thin out to where you're basically just drawing gifts and this every turn, and you're going to have an Ice Tornado that does, over 100 damage. Combine that with some spell weakness and boom, you got a winning game plan, right? So I thought that was a non-obvious interaction, but it's definitely worth noting. You can put Eternal Stone on any card. It doesn't even have to be a damage card. And it'll protect against the Gifts for the Guard. And then Hope for Peace. This is a artifact. Don't know why I didn't I probably meant to put the picture of the artifact, but anyway, at least I got a picture of a card that it affects. Anyway, you know, there's that cavern event where, like, this is one of the cards you could choose, Petrified Skull. You could also choose, like, the Blessed Sword or the Holy Shield, you know, the one that gives, like, a bunch of damage shield. When you choose those, initially those cards are cards where if you play them, they're permanently purged from your deck. But what you may not know is if you do not play them for, like, 3 rings, 2 rings, really. If you don't play them for 2 rings, that ring after the second ring that you didn't play it, you will get an artifact called Hope for Peace. It's kind of a hidden event because it's not really like obvious that this would happen, but at that point, it makes any card you have that has Purge a consume card instead. So you see Petrified Skull here, it now is just a 0-cost consume card, and I actually in this case upgraded it to have that Eternal Stone, so I could even just keep playing it throughout each fight without it even consuming, which is even more powerful, right? Literally just deleting tanks, which are like the hardest thing in the game to kill, in my opinion. Anyway, though, and that doesn't just apply to these cards. It applies to any card that has Purge, other than it no longer works for Monster Rail Spike. It used to, but now it doesn't. So it's worth noting it only applies to spells at this moment in the game, in the game's lifetime, we shall say. But you know that makes it so you can do like I mentioned before. There's like a cavern event that allows you to reduce the cost of a damage card down to 0, have it purge on play, and have like 20 extra damage, or maybe it's even more, something crazy like 20 or more damage. Now with the Hope for Peace, it just consumes. So now you've 0-costed and given a ton of damage to something that is now probably pretty useful. But yeah, it's worth noting Hope for Peace is really powerful. Very nice to just hold those if you can. Like, I would only play them if you think you absolutely need to win, like, and not die, because obviously this thing's so much more powerful later on in the game when you can just delete Gilded Wings at will. And then Purge and Endless. This was kind of a non-obvious interaction that I discovered the other day, actually. If you put the Monster Rail Spike, which is basically the upgrade from a cavern event that you can put on a unit that gives it plus 20 health, plus 20 damage. Once you play it, it's purged from the deck. And, you know, it's gone. However, if you have Endless, if you have the Endless upgrade, or if you apply it with a tome, then if it does die in that fight, it'll come right back into your deck, and it's actually back in your deck for good again. Obviously, it'll still purge if you play it again, but say you play that unit, it's Endless, it dies, and you don't play it again, it'll be in your deck for the next fight. And maybe you want that, because maybe that's like a really nice, easy way to get a plus 20/20 upgrade. Or maybe you don't want it, and if you don't want it, it's worth noting, like, maybe you want it Endless for a bit, but if you want it kind of to not be in your deck come next fight, you got to make sure that that thing stays in play and does not die. So just kind of a weird interaction, but that is how it works. And then Petty Theft, this is a real quick one. Another kind of hidden, similar to Hope for Peace. There is that one cavern event called the Ornate Chests, where you can choose to like give a small amount of HP for a small amount of coins, or give like a pretty large amount of HP for like 150 coins or something like that. If you have Petty Theft, by the time that event comes around, you can just give up Petty Theft, purge it from your deck to get 175 coins, which is even more than the gold that it would give you for like a lot of HP. So maybe not that important of a one to know, but I figured it was worth pointing out. And then this one, really nothing that's going to help your gameplay necessarily, but if you're an achievement hunter, or just maybe you like lore or just hidden gems, buy something, won't you? You'll notice an achievement named that. You can actually click on the shopkeeper's face over and over again, and you'll start to get like hidden lines of dialogue that'll give you, and eventually if you do it enough, he'll give you that hidden achievement. And on a similar note, I'm going to leave this one out there, but there's another, at least there might be even more, but there's at least one cavern event where I've noticed that you can do a similar thing on. I'll let you guess which one it is and find it on your own. I'm not going to give this one away, but try next time you see like a a cavern event that has some nice art. Try clicking around and see what happens. I'll let you discover that one on your own, though. And the next one we got here, pretty important one, is Overstacking Floors. So you have your pip limit on every floor, right? By default, it's 5 on higher Covenant levels. It'll be 4 on one random floor. That's the default. You know, the little dots that turn yellow when you've taken up one. You can exceed that limit through a few methods. The most straightforward one is going to be ascending or descending a unit from a different floor onto that floor. So say you have a floor with a pip space of 5, you put a Thorned Hollow in front, takes up 3 pip. You've got your Hellhorn Champ behind it, that takes up another 2 pip. You've now maxed out your pip at 5. You can't place any more units there. But let's say you have this card, Hidden Passage, which ascends a unit. And so now you play say an Animus of Will below that floor, and then you have Hidden Passage. You can play it on the Animus of Will, and it'll bring that Animus of Will up. And when it does enter a floor, either through ascend or descend, it'll come in the back. So now the Animus of Will is behind all those units. And even though your pip was full, it allows this to happen, and you'll just see that your pip is now over exceeded by 2. This does not work, though, if you're at the 7 unit limit. No matter what, there will never be an allowance for you to go over 7 units on any given floor. At least at the current time in this game. They may change that at some point, but I'm sure there will always be some number that is the overall unit limit. Right now, that's 7. Other ways that you can exceed it are via summons. So, you know, we've talked about summons, like Morsel Maker, pretty obvious one. Like if you place it down, if there's like only 1 pip left on a floor and you place it down, it will create 2 morsels, and those end up going over the pip limit. Also, Shrouded Mitosis, that's the Umbra rare card where you can click it on a morsel to like create 3 copies of it. That'll obviously allow you to go over the pip limit. Again, though, won't let you go over the 7 unit limit, so you might want to plan around that. And then also Remnant Host, you know, if it's full on pip, it creates 2 drafts, which are more pip than it had, because it's just a 1 pip unit. And it'll go over in that case too. Even more if you have the double extinguish artifact. And then sketches is obviously another easy way to do this. You know, sketches is one where you're incentivized to go over the pip limit with a bunch of big fat units that are expensive and you can get out for free. Looking at you, Shadow Siege. And then I already mentioned this, but basically when you enter, if you're going to ascend or descend a unit to a floor, it could be an enemy or a friendly, they'll come into the back. So try to get your frontliners down first. Otherwise, you're going to need to do things like March of Shields or Vine Grasp to manipulate the positioning around. Ideally, you want to be able to just put your set up your floor with your frontliners first, and then try to overstack with the other units in the back. And then also, you can overstack upgrades. I kind of mentioned this before, but you know, you have by default just 2 upgrade slots for your banner units, or units in general, you know, any unit really. And 3 if you get the Pyrestone Housing artifact, but you can actually go above the 2 or the 3 upgrade limit via cavern events. So things like the large or micro stone, the 25 HP that you can just get at the Blood for Blood event, the Monster Rail Spike, the Clergyman's upgrade, you know, it gives you the random 1 of 3 upgrades, all, you know, etc., etc. All these you can tack on the extra upgrades past the limit. Well past the limit, by the way. I've gotten units to like 5 or 6 upgrades before. I don't even know if there is a limit. If there is, I've never hit it. You can just keep stacking. That's why, and again, that's why I typically try to purchase Merchants of Steel's upgrades if they're on the map. If they're on the same sort of route as a cavern event, I would much rather give those purchases in and then visit the cavern, because remember, you can't back out of a cavern once you visit it. You can't like peek at what the cavern is and then go back. Like, you have to make your decision there. So it's nice to have your upgrades out of the way. Like, you already lock in a multi-strike, some other upgrade, maybe just double multi-strike even, and then add like a micro stone on top of it, or sometimes a large stone, typically micro stone, but yeah. Good to know, I would say. I mean, those are the type of misplays that can cost you a run. You know, it's not insignificant. And Armor Incant Railhammer. This I figured was a synergy worth pointing out. So obviously, just at a base level, it's strong with the Armor Incant that is available to Stygian. So when you have the combo of Hellhorn and Stygian, Railhammer, I would say, is a very, very top tier artifact. But what you might not realize is how bonkers it can actually get with the Merchant of Steel armor upgrade, the Incant armor upgrade that you can buy there. You know, it used to be 1, now it's 2. It may change in the future, but at the moment it's 2. So you buy it, you know, if you spend your 25 gold, you get +2 armor per incant on a unit. What's probably not so obvious about this, though, is that each of those upgrades are independent of any other armor incant upgrades. So, for example, if you put 2 of them on a unit, you're getting the Railhammer bonus twice. So, you know, say you bought 2 of those +2 armor incant upgrades, you might think of it as like, oh, I get 4 armor per incant, and if I get the Railhammer upgrade, that's an additional 4, so I'm getting 8. Not actually the case. It's actually 12, because you get 4 on each of the 2, if that makes sense. So it's 6 + 6. Over here, it's kind of illustrated too. Like Guardian Unnamed, it initially has the 3 armor incant, and I added another, you know, just the 2 armor incant. But because of Railhammer, you get 4, you know, +4 to every single incant, or +4 to every time you apply armor. It applies it twice here. So 7 and 6, that's 13 freaking armor per incant. That's insane. You should know this, because it can make runs pretty easy, and you might start looking for Railhammer more when you see Stygian and Hellhorn together, right? Offering and discards. So this wasn't super obvious to me either, but cards that are offered, you know, basically you discard them. Like Crypt Builder here, for example, you can offer it, discard it, and it'll play it for free. It still counts as being played. So say you had a holdover on Crypt Builder, it'll come back next turn. Say you wanted to incant, it counts as an incant. Say you wanted to not incant an enemy, well, it still counts as an incant. It counts as if it was played. Basically, it just counts as if it was played for 0. So that's good to know, especially I think the holdover thing, that's something I think might not be obvious. And if you say you really wanted to win a run, maybe you got your last gold card that you needed, and you're trying to figure out which card to put on holdover, and you don't know. Well, now you know. Now you know that that's an option at least. And then for the Arcus Incant chart, the one that like increases the cost of your cards when you incant, it is worth noting that it applies after you would discard. So like if I played Titan's Gratitude and discarded Crypt Builder, even though I play the Crypt Builder, it doesn't increase the cost of Crypt Builder in that case, or Titans. But it would increase, obviously, the other cards in the hand, or also if you say you had an Offering Monument on that floor, if you draw another card, that drawn card would also get the cost increase. So it's worth noting, just to make sure you're not increasing the cost on cards that you don't want it increased on. But it's also worth noting, and even let's say it just throws away something that's not an offering card, still in that case it's not going to apply the Ember cost to the thrown away card. So maybe you have an offering token and you really want to incant your floor, but you don't want to increase the cost of like Unleash the Wildwood or something, or not, that's a bad example. You don't want to increase the cost of something, we'll just say something. You can choose to throw that away and it won't get increased. Hopefully that makes sense. Frozen cards. Preserve must, so this preserve card here that applies frozen to a card in your hand, it is worth noting that if you have a card that isn't frozen and one that is, it will force you to do it on the one that's not frozen. And it doesn't care if it's a Blight or a Scourge card, so that can screw you over in some cases. So, if that's the case, you may want to just not play Preserve that turn. You just hold it for the next turn. Or alternatively, maybe you want to play out, say your already frozen card is like free or something. Maybe you want to like play that out. That might be good. Or maybe sometimes I do want to freeze a dead weight. It's good to know that you can do that as well. Sometimes I just want to freeze it so I don't redraw into it on a critical like redraw turn where I'm redrawing into my discard pile, or shuffling back into it, I should say. But it's not how Cuddle Hex and Icicle Fracture function. So remember, those are a unit and an artifact that basically freeze a random single card in your hand. It'll do it to any card that isn't already frozen, but it does not do it to Scourge or Blight cards. So that's also worth noting. Not much more to say on that. Spikes and Revenge. Spikes don't function exactly the same as Revenge. Key difference is that you can put damage shield on a unit with spikes, and it will still apply the spikes damage. Also, for what it's worth, there is that one enemy in Ring 1 that has damage shield and could get the spikes trial. Good to know in that case too, right? It's still going to apply the spikes damage. However, it does not trigger on Revenge procs. So say you had, we got little Icarus over here. She loves damage shield. You can stack damage shield as much as you want on her. She'll still be killing stuff with spikes. However, Soul Guard Cold Channel or like Frost Shark, they do not like damage shield. And if they want to kill people, at least if they want to apply their frostbite, yeah, they don't want damage shield because it's not actually going to trigger Revenge. Armor, however, still works for both. That one's kind of weird to me, like the fact that damage shield would not trigger Revenge and then armor still does. That seems a little inconsistent to me, but it's worth noting, at least at this time, that's how it is. That does function. So you can stack a bunch of armor on a Shark or a Soul Guard, and that'll be a-okay. It might even be preferred, some might say. Also, one nice thing about Revenge is you can target your own unit on a given turn with some damage spells just to trigger like an extra Revenge. That's totally fine and often a good thing to do. That's especially nice with torches, particularly on a Wrathful Hornbreaker Prince. But obviously spikes won't. Like you can't like shoot your Thorned Hollow to get an extra like damage of spikes to the floor. That one probably everybody knows, but I don't want to gloss over anything. I like to be thorough, or do I? Who knows? Units killed by spikes will still trigger slays. That's definitely something you want to know, both for the enemy and the good guy. Like that makes it pretty tough to take the spikes trial sometimes in Ring 1 against those damage shield dudes. That can represent a lot of extra damage to your Pyre if you accidentally like have a backliner imp rush in and try to get it's definitely not worth 1 damage to give that guy damage shield, essentially, right? So it's worth noting that slays are triggered by spikes, but you as well. If you haven't experienced the greatness that is Hornbreaker Prince Wrathful Path with spikes, oh boy, you got to do that. You gotta. Tell you what, if you haven't done that, you can pause this video right now, fire up Awoken, and help Hornbreaker Prince. Do it. You will have some fun. It's powerful. Units with strike effect will not apply if they die to spikes. This one was pretty weird to me. I don't know if this will always, like, this could be something I see like quote unquote fixed in the future. But it is worth noting, if you strike, you have your strike effects, right? So like a good example of an enemy with a strike effect is the Pyre Wings. They're the red and black winged endgame units that can sweep you and apply Ember Drain. So on strike, they apply Ember Drain. Or like example of one of our units would be like Cold Salia applies Frostbite on strike. Well, an annoying thing is you'd think that it just applies it on strike whether they die or not, right? Well, actually, if you die to spikes as you're striking them, it does not apply the effect. I repeat, it does not apply the effect. You can use this to your advantage, but also avoid your own disadvantage. Because I have been screwed by that in the past when I relied on a strike effect to happen, and it did not happen because I died to spikes. But similarly, you can use it to your advantage. As I said, that unit does Ember Drain. If you keep your Icarus alive, your whole floor alive, really, and a Pyre Wing tries to attack you, as long as you're killing it with the spikes, doesn't actually apply any Ember Drain. So that's definitely something worth knowing. Outside of the obvious trigger, if they have, if you attack and kill a unit, and also I mentioned spikes, you can also do it with summons, oddly enough, which may or may not come into play, but sometimes it might be that little extra bit of knowledge that can take you over the edge on some of those close runs. So example, like there's this artifact, Consume Crown, that gives you +2 damage on Slay. You can see this in full effect if you have this artifact and you have like a Molting Imp. That's the imp that does 5 AoE damage when you play it. Every unit you kill will add damage to that imp right then and there, which is pretty wild. So you can definitely use that to your advantage to get like a imp that might have a little bit of damage to get you through some of those early rings. But you will, it's a little bit, I don't want to say inconsistent, but it's not obvious the things it works and doesn't work on, but like you're not going to gain them on revenge. So like if you kill a unit through revenge, it's not going to do it. And also actions. So like the Imperialist Queen, the one that explodes imps, if you explode the imps, it's not going to count those as slays. And if the exploded imps kill any enemy units, it's also not going to count those as slays. So it's weird to me that summons do and that doesn't, for example, but it is how it currently is, and worth noting so that you don't, so that you A, don't make the mistake of assuming that it does for those, but B, also that you know that it does for the other ones, so you can use that to your advantage. And then Spell Shield and Pierce, you'll see this mainly with trials, but or just some certain enemies, they'll get Damage Shield or Spell Shield. You can bypass it with Pierce. I think that's maybe not super obvious. Mainly people just know that you can pierce armor with it, but it actually pierces through those buffs as well. Also, Razorsharp Edge, as I mentioned before, doesn't care about them either. In either case, though, Razorsharp Edge or piercing attacks, it will not burn the buff of Damage Shield or Spell Shield. It'll simply go through them, do the damage, and if it doesn't kill them, and you're actually looking to burn the buff, you should have this knowledge that it's not actually going to do that, so you don't make a mistake and end up actually, maybe using Ember that could have been better used somewhere else. Maybe a Plink would have been better to just burn something so you can kill it. Definitely worth noting. Trample. Trample has got a weird interaction with sweepers. In particular, this is my opinion, but it seems to be way more useful for units that already have AoE than just big single attackers. Because in my opinion, there's not that many units that just do one single big attack. To me, the purpose of Trample would be like for that, but actually it's much more useful for sweepers. And let me explain why that is. So when you sweep and say you kill some backliners, or even frontliners, it doesn't matter. As long as you're killing some units with your sweep, the trample gets applied to those units that it kills, and it does it on every single one of them. So I have kind of an example lined out here. Say you have a 20 attack damage sweep attack, and the floor has a 100 HP tank and a 5 HP backliner. It will, instead of just doing 20 damage to that tank, it does it all at once. It kills, it takes the extra 15 from the 5 HP backliner and applies it right to the front tank. So it actually does 35 damage to the tank in that case. And so on and so forth for every other unit killed. If there was 2 5 HP backliners, for example, it would do 50 damage to the frontliner. So in a lot of senses, it can kind of function as a multi-strike or even more as far as waves are concerned. It's almost more useful than multi-strike for trample or for sweeper units. Trample is pretty wild. Not how I would like expect it to function, I guess, but that is how it functions currently, at least. Maybe they change that someday, but that is currently how it functions. But if I have any decent damage seeing sweeper, Umberstone becomes a pretty high priority pick for me. And now we got flying bosses. Rings 3, 6, and Seraph, I kind of mentioned before, what are knowing as flying bosses. They're kind of present the entire time. You can attack them, you can target them with spells, you can ascend them and descend them, and sometimes they can attack you even, but usually they're just not attacking you and just doing stuff. Not all of them are assholes like Seraph the Patient and Talos. But anyway, that is another tangent for another time. Prior to Relentless, Relentless meaning, the actual boss waves themselves, you can play Ascend on these flying bosses, and you'll always be protected against accidentally ascending them to your pyre. So this can allow you to do things like if you have, say, a Siren Song, which is only playable at the top floor, and it ascends the units there and dazes them. Well, since if you play it, as long as it's not the final, Relentless boss rounds, you can just use that on the top floor when these flying bosses are there to simply stack 3 Dazed. Or if you double stacked it, 6 Dazed. That's very useful for something like Seraph the Patient, in my opinion. But again, beware not to do it during Relentless, because during Relentless, that protection goes away. And if you play, Ascend, Crane, Siren Song, anything like that, it's going to put them right up to your pyre, and you're not going to like that, most likely. There's also a weird interaction. This is mainly just, I think, when you're going for score. But, normal non-flying bosses, they can come in with a haste unit, and that haste will apply to them, and they'll all, run right onto the top floor after that round, right? But it doesn't do that for flying bosses. I would not be surprised if this is quote-unquote fixed in the future. To me, that seems like a bug. I can already tell you from a programming standpoint, I know why it happens. It's because there are haste units in a lot of these flying boss fights, and they wouldn't want that to make the boss go up during the flying, the normal waves, so to speak. But and also they probably didn't expect the haste unit to still be around once Relentless starts, so they never undid the sort of immunity to haste, so to speak, once Relentless starts. But if you're going for score, I assume there'd be nice plays sometimes where you would just root the haste unit the turn before Relentless starts. That way I could just have the haste unit there for that, and then haste it on up to my actual stacked floor on the top to get a 2-turn boss rush. Doesn't function that way. It will just ignore the haste unit. The haste unit will still run on to the top the next turn, but the boss will still just move to floor 2. And I think that's inconsistent. I think they should change that. That doesn't seem proper to me, because even though it's a flying boss, as we've seen before, I can't play Siren Song during the Relentless round. If I play Siren Song in the Relentless round, it's going to move it on up to the top floor. So to me, it's now functioning as a normal Relentless boss at that point, and haste should affect it the same. That's just my opinion. But worth noting, that's how it is currently. So if you're, I play in tournaments now lately. I'm so glad that we have them in the community. Shout out to Never Nathaniel and Narninian for putting those on. They'll be in my list for sure of recommended streams. But anyway, more and more daily challenges as well. You might be going for score. Kind of sucks that interaction isn't there, right? I would love to have that as an interaction. But that's a tangent again, and let me just get off that tangent. Also worth on that score note, the whole reason for that even being a thing is because you can you can do these boss rushes, but in particular with these flying bosses, you can kill them before the Relentless even starts, and in those cases, you get an even better score than you could normally get. So that's worth noting if you're going for score. And Seraph Pathing, I thought it was worth pointing a little bit of this out. He will prioritize, as long as it's not the Diligent. Basically, every Seraph other than the Diligent will prioritize a floor if it has units on them. It will try not to visit an empty floor if it can, but it will visit empty floors if it's already on the only floor that has units on them, if that makes sense. But it will come right back to the floors that have units. So sometimes multi-floor setups or even just some trump blockers on the other floors might be enticing to try to trick the AI of Seraph to go to those floors. Along with him visiting those floors, the effects that Seraph does will also prioritize floors that have units on them. So in the case where you only set up on one floor and the other 2 floors are empty, even if he's going to visit, every other turn, if he's going to visit an empty floor, he'll still prioritize, he or she, I forget if Seraph's a guy or girl, Seraph will prioritize whatever effect it does. Like Seraph the Patient does melee weakness, Seraph the Chaste removes debuffs, or removes debuffs and buffs, so on and so forth. It will do that effect still on the floor that has units on them. So even in that case, you might be enticed to still just set some chump blockers up on the other floor, even if it's just 2 floors, just so that it plays that effect like melee weakness on another floor instead of just always putting it on your floor that has units on them. And on that note as well, it will prioritize spawning the Lightwings. That's the 15 damage, 3 health dude that it spawns basically almost every turn, depending on the variant of Seraph. It will prioritize spawning them on the floors with units on them, which can also be used to your advantage or disadvantage. Now, unfortunately, Diligent just doesn't care about that at all. He'll go wherever he wants, or she. Seraph. We'll say Seraph Diligent goes wherever they want. And that can be annoying, especially when you're going for score, because the Lightwings, if you're going for a bottom floor setup, which is often the best way to get a good score, those Lightwings can just come in on the top and you'll have a naked floor that just can't deal with them. So it is worth noting that Diligent does that, and you might want to prepare accordingly. You might want just some little unit up there that can finish them off, or have a few damage spells here and there that can kind of hit them. Even a sting or 2 might be nice. Yeah, but worth noting, definitely worth noting how the AI works, right? And Pyre Room, this is, I should have maybe put this earlier because this is actually really useful, I think. You can play any non-targeted spell up in the Pyre Room. So you know, have your 3 main floors. Well, you can hover up to the Pyre Room and play non-targeted spells there, just to kind of burn them up there. That's particularly useful if you're trying to avoid like incants for the enemy. Sometimes you'll have all 3 floors of enemies with incanters on them. And it's nice just to go up to the top. Like say you have like a morsel miner, making of a morsel, the card that makes a morsel miner. You can just go right on up to the top room and play that. That way you don't trigger any enemy incants, and then you still get your morsel maker, and then you can put, or your morsel miner, and you can put it wherever you please after that. It also might just be useful to burn a spell. Maybe there's like a Inferno that has Consume on it, and you just want to burn it without actually killing your units. You could do that. And also, yeah, this is kind of both on the last and this one, but you can ascend bosses on floors to cheat the boss rush score multiplayer. So for example, you get 30% extra score if you finish a boss at the bottom floor on the Relentless rounds. And then every floor he ascends is going to be a minus 10% to that multiplier. Well, you can actually still set up on the top floor, for example, and if you can ascend the unit up, it will not count against that multiplier. So say you have like 2 hidden passages, you can play both, and you can still finish the fight on the top floor in that case, yet still get your full 30% boss rush multiplier. Only really for people that care about score. You can probably ignore that if you don't care about score. But trust me, I'm telling you, I'm going to plug it again. These tournaments have been so freaking fun that have been getting put on, and I hope more and more get put on. I think it's a whole element of the game that if you haven't explored, I'd check it out. It adds a whole new element to the game. It's so fun going for score. I can't believe I never did this before, but it's awesome. And then this is a freebie. We could call this maybe the 36th fact here, but not related really at all to Pyre Room here. But I figured it was worth noting since I was on the subject of Relentless rounds here. You can root a normal enemy on those floors where the boss is coming in for Relentless, and it'll just stay rooted and the boss will ascend and it will end up killing that unit. So you can use that as like a pseudo way to kill maybe a tank or a backliner if you need to do that. It's worth knowing, I think. Sometimes it might save you. And as my voice is almost ready to give out, I'm finally on the final fact here, number 35, even though it's really like 37 or something. So, but 35, because that's a round number. Pay attention to targeting. A lot of spells that are typically only thought of as things you play on enemies, and conversely, that you only play on allies. A lot of them can be played on either side, and it's quite beneficial to know how useful it is to do that sometimes. And these aren't even all of them, but these are the ones I figured I would call out. And let's just go through each one of these, and that will kind of be the end of this very long guide that I hope was useful for people. Please let me know in the comments if it was or not. But first, let's get through these. So March of Shields, you often only think of it as putting it on a friendly unit, right? Well, that's not limited to that. You can put it on enemy units. Sure, you'll give them 10 armor, but I do this quite often with March of Shields. It is totally useful to you sometimes to bring an enemy backliner or even just like second line tank forward. And who cares about the 10 armor? So this is usually a play I'm making late game, and I do not care about that 10 armor. What I care about is that I just now displaced the sort of shielded tank from the front, and now I can kill the unit from behind. It's super useful to do that. And in a similar sense, Vinegrass can be used on your own units, just like March of Shields. You know, you can bring a tank from the back to the front, or simply shuffle maybe 2 tanks around to try to preserve some damage. I find Vinegrasp is similar to March of Shields late game, usually often more useful to use on my own units, oddly enough, especially if I'm using like ascend or descend mechanics, and it's like awkward for me to get the right frontliner in front. Vinegrass can pull you out of that situation quite literally, quite nicely. And then we'll group all these 4 here together: Torch, Rail Spikes, Subsiding Blade, and Entumbra Assault. You could add others here like Hornbreak, the Frostbite common, a bunch of others, but basically these single target attacking cards that don't limit to enemies or friendlies are so often useful for killing your own units or damaging them either way. Like Torch is so useful for just sacrificing an imp on your floor that's like stuck on the backline, welder helpers in particular. Then you can actually play out more or just other stuff. And you can also use it just to put in some damage on a unit that has revenge. Great example of that is the Wrathful Hornbreaker Prince. You might just want to build up the rage on him so he can get that first slay and really start rolling there. Similarly, like a Timber Assault, you really want to create morsels with it, and sometimes you don't have an enemy to do it with, but you can then use it on a friendly. You could even use it on a rubber morsel. Often you don't really want them, but if you generate one, you can try to get 2. You know, you're guaranteed to not get rubber morsels from Entumbra Assault, so why not just put the rubber morsel down, shoot it with Entumbra, get 2 better morsels, right? Also with like Subsiding Blade, I find it's probably, for me, in my play, far more useful on my own units than enemies. To be able to target your own unit in Melting Remnant and kill it is very important in many strategies, particularly like Little Fade. Firelight, you often want to do this just to get that extra stats and burnout and then reform the same turn. And it really gets you scaling a lot faster. But anything really, like I'll even use it on like an Animus of Will just to get it into the reform pool and start it building burnout and stuff on it. Same with Rail Spikes, same idea as Blade, I would say. Just use it for self-sacrifice. Root Seeds is a fun one. You could say a few other ones here too, like but mainly that you can play it on an enemy. A lot of times you want to draw a card next turn, and you don't have like a good target for yourself to play. Maybe you have Titan Channel Soul Guard. Maybe you just have like Arcus with the Incant shard on your main floor, but you still want to draw a card, so you just put it on an enemy you don't care about. You can even put it on a healer enemy, by the way, and it won't. All it will do is just make their heal do 2 more damage. Like, who cares about that, right? And even sometimes you may just want to give the enemy damage to trigger an extra revenge, or have them trigger against your spikes if they don't have any attack. Like, sometimes it's useful for that. So Root Seeds, as good as it is, it's even better once you start realizing there's sometimes it's useful just to put it on an enemy. And Petrified Skull actually goes right in with Rail Spikes and Blade. When I'm playing Melting Remnant, I'm often using this on my own units, especially if it's like a big tank that's hard to sacrifice but would be awesome to get into the reform pool. Petrified Skull is really nice for that. Hoarfrost is a fun one. I bet you even veterans of the game haven't used this one. So, maybe I'm talking out of line there, but I got a fun one for you. This is definitely in the vein of going for score, but this is a great way to get flying kills, particularly in the Umbra and Stygian combo. Here's what you do, because you can play it on your own guy. That's what I think. Nobody really does this. I've done this though. I wish I can't remember if I have any recordings of this, but I'm going to be sure to do it now that I've mentioned it. The best I ever did this, I don't think I have a recording of it, but it was one of the coolest flying kills I've ever set up. I had Superfood Primordium, a bunch of ways to get damage shield. Remember, Frostbite, if you have damage shield, all it does is just eat up 1 stack of damage shield. If you have Superfood Primordium, you usually have, tons of damage shield. What I would do is, remember your debuffs stack on Superfood as well. I played it on Superfood after stacking some Frostbite on the floor, and then that would then, on top of that Frostbite stacking from my Superfood to my Frontliner, essentially doubling it again that it already was doubled. I then can keep doubling it because it was on holdover. And I could get flying kills no problem within 3 waves. It was crazy. Because you can just do like 5,000 Frostbite by turn 3. It's crazy. A similar vein, you can drain your own guys if you don't. If you need an Incant, for like the case of Titan Channel, Soul Guard, or just any Soul Guard, or any Incanter really, you could sap a Frost Shark. He's not going to care about that, right? But it's worth noting that you can sap your own guys, even if it's just for an Incant. But sometimes you do actually want to get their damage down. Like say there is a Animus of Will, and it's like early game, or maybe even late game, mid-late game, and it's not going to survive spikes. You can drain it and just have it there for the boss rounds, right? If you can scale it out later, sometimes that's the only way you can win sometimes and still take like a spikes trial. Or sometimes you don't have a choice. Like, there's Ring 2, there's spikes sometimes, and you don't have a choice. Like trial or no, there's just spikes. And in those cases, sapping your Animus of Will might be the right decision. Or just any sweeper unit, any low health unit, backliner that you don't want to die to spikes, you can do drain on them, and that's totally a legit way to do it. Trap shoot, you can use it to, again, make your units not attack if you want, but mainly I use it to do a crazy like overstack, because that you can do that from the 3rd floor on down to the 2nd, much less the 2nd, or the 3rd to the 1st. Still do it from the 2nd to the 1st as well, but I find the flexibility to be able to do that like right before Relentless rounds, because I usually don't care about the days that much if my frontliner is good enough on floor 1. And I can take a backliner that I was scaling at the top that was like finishing off those initial waves, and then if I have it like permafrost for the Relentless rounds, I can just bring them down, and now I have an overstacked floor with a pretty good backliner, and I can still get that 3-turn boss rush. And then Perils, this one doesn't fit as much into there, but I never mentioned it specifically, and I figured it was worth mentioning that you can obviously, well, not obviously, but you can play Perils on your units that are about to be consumed, Morsels, right? Or just units that are about to die for whatever reason. And it's essentially free energy and sometimes free damage in that case. I figured that was worth pointing out because I hadn't pointed it out anywhere, and I feel like that is kind of a basic that should be known for like all players. Might make you more inclined to take this card because it's a pretty good card, and if you don't you're skipping it often, you're kind of blowing it, I would say. And with that, my voice is almost completely shot. I gotta tell you, I need some water. And thank you for getting through all this. No harm, no foul if you skipped around. I'd expect you to. Hopefully those chapter markers were useful. Hopefully the guide was useful. And again, go to the description, check out those streams, check out those channels. Highly recommend them. YouTube algorithm does not let us get any views. It just doesn't. It's up to all your kind hearts to help us out. So my dog is scratching on the door, so that's it from me. This is Gabriot. Thanks for watching. Peace.